Good. Looks like it should probably flatten out about frame 20. So we'll go ahead and type no rotation on frame 20. Comes up, sets down. So for the rest of it, he's okay. Now that's just one foot. Let's go ahead and close that one. Click on the other foot and bring up its spine window.
How did you get the foot to fill that window?
There's multiple ways of zooming in within a window. You can use the regular zoom and zoom in and out, which you can get it to fill the window manually. You can use the zoom and then right-click around the foot, or right-click around an area that you're interested in, like the toe, and that will zoom in on that portion. Or the third method is to right-click the zoom, which fits the whole foot within the window. Now there's a keystroke for zoom, which is Z, and Shift Z is the same as right-clicking on that, which is how I've been fitting it really quickly within the window. So no matter how this looks, whether it be way zoomed in, I can hit Shift Z and it's centered in the window. Comes in handy. So we'll do a similar thing for this foot. We go back to frame 1, which he should be quite a bit bent. Oh, I haven't assigned a spine yet for this foot, so it's asking me to assign one. Yes. So here's our completed action now that we've placed the spine motion on the feet. Again, not the greatest job, but a little tweaking and he'll be perfect. Okay, let's jump back out of here and go back to direction, where we started from. And all those changes we made will now be on him, and he will no longer have his feet passing through the ground as bad as they were. Everything will be good. Now, like I said, we only have one action on him currently in the script. Let's go ahead and take a look at that script. And let's do something you had asked about a little earlier, whether you could stack another action on top of an action. He's currently walking and doing pretty much strictly skeletal motion, with the exception of the feet that we just did. That's spine motion. But he's doing no facial expression. And since this walk is something that's very, what we call libraryable, it can be used over and over again, we don't necessarily want to embed a talking action into that walk, because not every time we want to use that walk is he going to be saying the same thing. That's where action overloading comes in. We want to add another action on top of that, that he will continue to walk, but yet he will also be carrying out this action. The walk was built for 31 frames. I'm going to stretch it out to be 100. And since the beginning and the ending frame of that particular walk when it was built was exactly identical, we don't necessarily want that to repeat over and over again, because it's the same frame. Otherwise you'd get a little surge or a pause every time that action repeated. That's where overlap comes in. You're telling it that the first and last frame are the same, so skip one of those. Since I've only got it entered in the action list one time to carry out for 100 frames, he's going to go through one complete walk cycle over 100 frames. And you'll notice as he does this, he's doing an awful lot of sliding. And this is a very hard problem to overcome in computer animation software. You know, to get the guy to look like he's permanently attached to the ground and not drifting or sliding or slipping, peeling out. You know, depending on how long this path is, if I made this path really long, he's going to be even sliding even worse, because he's only going to take one set of steps to get through that whole path, because that's all we said to do. And of course you could manually have him take another step and adjust the length of the path until you finally got it to look pretty good, but that's very tedious. So we've added a feature called stride length, and I'll show you how that works. I'm going to bring up the script again, click on the walk action. You'll notice there's two options down here, normal or use stride length. The use stride length item is ghosted right now because it's not available. This action was never set up to have a stride length. So let's go ahead and set it up to where we can use a stride length. We'll edit that action. And you'll see there comes Ted. Let's get a side view of him, zoom out, and step through this. Now you'll notice Ted's walking along, and since we know how far Ted's going to be moving along the path. As far as the program goes, it knows how far he needs to move. It knows you want him to walk. The only variable it's missing is how long is his stride. The program needs to know how far each one of his steps take for him to complete a step. And if it knew that, it could then prevent his feet from slipping. So that's all we need to do, is just mark how long each one of his steps are. And we do that by picking a good frame where we see maybe his foot come down to the ground. Let's watch his heel. I'm going to zoom in. Just watch the heel of his foot as it hits the ground, and it's starting to come back now. So I'm going to go back to that frame where it hit the ground, right about there. And I'm going to say this is the beginning of his stride by clicking the stride button with my left button and clicking down, and you can see a little yellow mark. This is the mark of the beginning of the stride, right about there. You don't have to be perfectly accurate. This is going to do a heck of a lot better job than you could ever try to guesstimate doing it the previous way I told you about. So now I'm going to advance through frames and follow that heel back until it starts to lift off the ground, which is right about there. So I can go back a frame, and I'm going to mark with my right button, say this is the end of the stride. So now you can see it stretching out a little ruler, and it's saying every one of these ticks is a frame, and I'm saying that that is where he ends. Now if you step through these frames, if it were a perfect action, he would move one tick for every frame. And this one's not perfectly laid out, but it's going to look pretty darn good when we get into there. Now that the computer knows the action, or the stride length for this action, it can then make him walk perfectly across this path if we tell it to use the stride length. Okay, now as we advance through the frames, you can see he takes many steps to get to the end, because the computer now knows that if he's going to get that far, he's going to have to take a lot of steps to get there, because it knows how long his steps are. So you can see he perfectly steps without sliding at all. And now in that action list, you notice we set 100 frames. That no longer means carry out this action, this one action, in 100 frames. This means carry out this action as many times as you need to over a period of 100 frames. Let's close that up. He looks pretty good.
It's very nice.
Now if we shorten this path to be very short, he's of course not going to have to take as many steps to get to the end, but he still never slips. We covered how to basically make your paths, put them out in the choreography, place a character on the path, cameras, lights, and also how to build a script for your characters, coming from already made actions or creating your own new actions. But we haven't covered how you actually create a character. So now I'd like to go into the third module, which is called Character. You can go in that by clicking the Edit Character button after clicking on Ted, and it'll bring up Ted in the Character window. And this is basically where Ted was put together and assembled in his hierarchy, as we call it. You know, the knee bones connected to the shin bone and that type of thing. Let's put Ted in his vector representation. Let's see. Let's put all of his body parts in there by right-clicking it. If you have a particular piece selected in here by clicking on it, you can choose a draw mode for that particular piece by left-clicking the draw mode. Now his arm is inbound. You can right-click it, and it will do that whole branch, that piece and every one of its children in the hierarchy. So by clicking on his pelvis and selecting right-click on vector, it puts every piece in his whole body in vector mode.
Could you explain to me how the hierarchy works?
Basically, you start out from the root, which is typically on a biped like this. That'd be your torso or your pelvis, and you add pieces to that. And every time you add, that's basically a child. And I'll get into that, and I'll add another piece to Ted here in a little bit. Right now, I'm going to show you how you can change some attributes on him. When I've got his torso clicked, whatever is selected is red. Any of its children or directly below it become purple. So if I select his upper shoulder again, you'll see it's red and all of its children are purple. Children, grandchildren, and so on. Let's go back to the body again. And we'll click this little palette button, which will bring up the segment attributes. Each one of the pieces within TED is called a segment. A bunch of segments put together, or even a single segment figure, is called a character or a figure. So a collection of segments built up in a hierarchy is called a character. So if you bring up the attributes requester, you'll get a list of segments up in the segment list. This is the whole hierarchy of TED. Pelvis, the head, the tongue, the teeth, every piece of them is in this list. And every piece of TED has its own set of attributes. So if I wanted to select maybe, let's go ahead and select his main portion of his body, his pelvis. You'll see a segment color here and a variety of different attributes you can set. The ambience, roughness, specularity, reflectivity, transparency, and refraction. I'll kind of go over those here. Let's first change the color of Ted's torso. Let's make Ted bright green. And really quickly we'll jump back out of here and get a rendering of Ted. Again, this is the first time we've rendered him, so it takes a little bit. And you'll see it's totally green. Let's go back into that attributes requester and change the ambience of TED. Now, ambience is how bright the particular segment is when no light is cast upon it. With no ambience, you get really harsh edges on an object. With a lot of ambience, it'll be totally washed out. At 100%, he'll be totally lit up even on the back side of him where there's no light. Kind of gives the appearance of self-illumination. So as you can see, if I close this, right now he's got a little bit of highlighting around him. If I quick render just half of them here, you'll see that he's totally washed out. There's no shading whatsoever. Let's bring that back up. Put the ambience back down. And I'll show you what specularity does. Specularity is the shininess you get off of the corner of objects. Take for instance this mouse. If you take a look at it, there's white specular highlights on the corners of the plastic. Plastic objects are very specular. Softer things are not. The harder something is, typically the more specular it is. Roughness is exactly what it says. It makes the appearance of the surface look rough. I'll show you what that will do. Let's go back to something a little brighter. How about that green? Now I've got roughness and specularity on. You're going to see on this back, it kind of breaks up the specular reflection instead of being so perfect and crisp. Now he's kind of got a rough surface to him. And with each pass of the render, you're going to see a more accurate representation of that. Okay, let's go back in there again. Show you what reflectivity does. And again, it's pretty self-explanatory. It makes the surface of him, or his pelvis right now, highly reflective. So we'll probably catch a reflection if we do it from here of probably his arm. Let it refine a little bit. I could probably turn up the reflection a little more. I can see it just barely there. Let me go back in and turn up the reflection some more. Turn it up to 70%. Bring down the roughness a little bit. As you can see, by coming back and forth and playing with these settings, you can pretty much get about any particular surface you may want. Now you can see the reflection of his arm within his body. It looks very shiny, kind of glass looking, but yet I still have a little bit of roughness on him. The last setting we have, actually we got kind of a transparency goes in combination with refraction. If you've got transparency turned up, it does what it says. It makes that particular segment transparent. And refraction gives you the ability to bend light. As objects behind it is going to appear warped through the surface to give you like the ability to do glass or water. Once you've got a material how you like it, and maybe I want to put that on the rest of Ted's body, I can come over here. I've got his pelvis selected. I've got that particular material I like. I can copy that. Then I can go to another piece, like say his head, and I can paste that. Now the other item, which is pretty fun to play with, is called projection mapping. In the middle of this requester, you've got a large section in which you can add maps or images, which maybe came from a paint program or scanned in or any of the above. Let's go ahead and add one of those. I've got his pelvis selected. Let's see if I can't find an image out here somewhere on my hard drive. Let's just take this gradient image here. I loaded that into the map list. Now it's selected as being a type of type normal. There's different methods of applying this image onto the surface of him. We'll leave it as normal and I'll give you an idea of what that looks like. What that did was take that image and apply it onto the surface of his torso. And all it is just a gradient from blue to purple, this particular image I used, but it could be anything. A normal map is what you just saw. It takes the color of your image and places it on the surface. The next type would be transparency map. And what that does is take the grayscale value of your image as if it were black and white, or it could be a black and white image, and the intensity of that gray value, the whiter it is, the more opaque the surface is. The blacker it is, the more transparent it is. So that basically gives you the ability to have a irregular transparent surface. Comes in handy if you want to do maybe like a shower door or something like that where it's not a perfectly transparent. It varies over the surface. Bump map is again a grayscale image where the intensity of gray determines how high a bump is on the surface. So if you've got white within an image, that appears raised on the surface of your object. Black would appear lowered, so you can get your own type of roughness. If you wanted veins or anything like that, you could actually paint them in a paint program as a bump map and apply them to the surface, and they would actually appear raised on him without having to do the hard work of actually modeling it. A lot of times bump maps come in handy for making objects look a lot more complex than they really are. Specular map is a grayscale map that determines the amount of specularity over an area according to the gray value. Diffuse map is very similar. It darkens any particular color on the object according to the gray value within the map. Reflectivity, again, is a grayscale. The whiter it is, the more reflective. The darker, the less reflective. Ambience, very similar. Whiter, more ambient. Black, no ambience. And the cookie cut map works very much the same way as a normal map, except for when you're in a paint program, you typically have the ability to choose a background color within an image. I don't know if you're familiar with doing that, but once you've chosen a background color in that image and you use it on your segment, anything that's background color disappears. This is useful if you maybe want to scan in a leaf from an oak tree. You could paint out the edges of it with white, set your background color to white, and place this on a surface. Anything that's white now disappears. So you don't necessarily have to model an oak leaf. It could be on a simple plane. Stamp that on there. Everything else disappears and it looks like an oak leaf without doing any modeling whatsoever. Techniques are different ways of wrapping this image on your particular segment. Default is planar. That means it basically gets projected on there. It's the name projection maps. As if it were a slide projector and the segment was standing in front of it. Projects straight through and you'll get probably some smearing down the sides if it's a rounded shape.
The back then would have nothing on it?
The back would have the same thing as the front. It projects clear through it, just like an X-ray basically. Spherical is similar except for it's from all angles, from all sides. So it actually wraps top to bottom, back to front, as if it were a globe. I don't know if you've seen when they unwrap a globe picture and make it into a wall map. Very similar unwrap. So those are your different techniques for wrapping it onto there. Value gives you the ability to up the amount of, say like on a bump map, it's not rough enough, but yet you don't want to go back to the paint program and repaint your veins. You can raise the bumps by changing this value. We'll now show you how you might add items to a particular character, such as Ted. Ted's pretty well complete, but maybe you want to add something into his hand, like he's carrying something. The hierarchy is very important, what you have selected when you add this new piece. Because if I have his head selected when I add this piece, and you go into action, and you go to create an action, this piece's parent is the head. So whenever the head moves, this piece moves. If you move a piece, all of its children move with it. So we want the parent of this segment to be the hand. So we're going to go ahead and add a segment. This is a list of available segments that are already within TED. And I don't necessarily want to use one that he already has, so I'm going to start a new segment. And depending on what we want him to carry, maybe a simple vase. We go into the last module, which is called sculpture, and this is where you actually build your individual segments. You add points in here much the same way you did in direction, by clicking the add point button. You'll never find a single point by itself in sculpture, though. There's always at least a spline, because that's basically what you're adding is a spline. So I'm just going to build kind of a cross section of a vase, a really simple one here. Maybe add a little bit of a lip to it and a little bit of a base to it. And you can see this pivot here. This is what I'm going to lay around. So I'm going to take this cross section and spin it around this using the lathe function. So there's our little vase. And I can turn and look at this vase from any view. Zoom out, zoom in. Notice I didn't get this hole on the bottom very small, so we can use one of the modeling features. Let me go to the top here. I'm going to select that. And I'll use a similar thing that we used back in direction called complement spline. That will select every point on that spline. So notice I got every point around that ring selected now. I can use the scale feature. Go to bird's eye view here. Now I don't want it to scale in the Y direction. If you're looking from the front, up and down is Y, left and right is X, and through the screen is going to be Z. I don't want to scale it in Y, so I'm going to turn off the Y scale. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit the scale button. Scale those points down to where they're basically non-existent. That way we've got a sealed off bottom to our vase. Let's go ahead and get a rendering of that. See what that looks like. Got a solid shaded red little vase here. Looks like we could have maybe pulled the top in a little further, but we've already lathed it now. So I'll give you an example of how you could probably still go ahead and take care of this. I'm going to group the top points. So now I've got all those selected. I'm going to use a feature called extrude. I'm going to click on the extrude button and go ahead and pull these points. And what that does is just pull another section out of that. This time I'm going to pull it down inside of it, so that gives it a lip to the vase. It should look a little better up top. I've actually got a curved lip. Okay, so let me scoot this over to the side, and you'll see back in character, Ted's got this big huge vase in his hand. Let's go ahead and scale this whole vase down, turn the Y back on, and scale it down a little. And we now can see that there's a vase over here. I'm going to jump back to character. Maybe make my window a little smaller. Click on that vase. It's not perfectly in his hand, so I'm going to take that vase and translate it using the translate button. And move it over to where it is on his hand, or at least close to it. Okay. And if we render him, you'll see that the vase is now part of him. Okay. And what we want to do is maybe put a kind of a little spout on the front of the vase. We can group these points here and pull them out. You'll see that happens in all four views. See what that looks like. So there we've got a little spout. You can manipulate points at the point level, pull individual points out. You can group many points and manipulate them all at the same time.
This brings me to a question. What if you make a mistake?
We have an undo feature. Like I just pulled that point out there. Select undo, pops right back. So anything you do basically while you're in sculpture can be undone. If I was to, say, group all these top ones and do a rotate, see I'm twisting the top of this spout or bending it forward or back. I'm going to twist it and bend it over. Let's say we look at that and we didn't like it, we could still undo it and put it back the way it was. Other things you can do in here is, again, you have total control over the curvature of these splines. If I want this to be a little fatter, I can select the magnitude and increase that to get a real fat edge on the side of that. See what that looks like. Looks pretty good. You also can go to the other extreme and actually peak it to where it's totally peaked. And it will make a smooth transition into the side of the vase. You swing around to where we can see that. Grab this bottom section, and because it's basically the shape of a plate, I could take that and actually copy it. So I'll copy that piece, and now I will paste it wherever I want. So now I've got this piece that I just copied, and I paste it down below. And now I'm going to scale it up. And now we've got a little plate for our thing to sit on. There it is. Looks like it's a little below, so I'll select all these points. Now I selected every point within that particular piece by using the group connected. Anything that's connected to that particular point I had clicked, every other one will become selected too. So for instance, if I wanted to select this whole vase but not the dish underneath it, I could click here, hit group connected, and I'll get the whole vase but not the dish. So there's some pretty powerful grouping tools. And again, from here you have the ability to save groups. Like if I've already selected this vase, or even better yet, let's go to the front view, group the top of this, and add a group to our group list called top of vase. Now we've got that permanently into our group list. So anytime I want to recall that, no matter what I have selected, I can come up here, say top of vase, and I get that added to my group. Comes in handy. Okay. Well, let me jump back out of here and go back to direction. Give you an idea what that looks like out here. You find yourself jumping between modules quite a bit. Like, for instance, your director that's standing over your shoulder decides he doesn't particularly like that shade of blue. You may go into character, select that segment, bring up its attributes, and tweak on it. Maybe he wants it to be some shade of purple. And you can get pretty quick feedback as far as, you know, you can, how's that? And you think, perfect. And then jump back into sculpture, edit anything you want. Everything you do is instantly kicked back all the way back to direction. Basically makes a little tree. In direction you've got figures, in figures you've got segments. You can get down to the segment level. This is the lowest level you get to. The other thing that happens while you're within sculpture is texturing. We did a little bit of texturing using projection mapping and character. But projection mapping is kind of a loose way to get your images onto a surface. You don't have a lot of control over where it lands, it just projects it onto there. With this, with decaling, which we'll get into here, I'll show you, I can precisely place my image. So we'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to bring up the decal list, which is here. And we'll bring up that same image again that we used earlier. Let's go ahead and close this. I'm going to quick render this vase, and I'm going to take that decal that I've loaded into the decal list and go ahead and paste that onto the side of it. And like I said, you can precisely place this anywhere. You can also size the decal using the size button. I'm going to go ahead and leave it this size and click right there. Let me spin around this face and get a different view of it. And when we render it now, you'll see that that decal conformed to the side of the vase and stuck on there. Basically to show you what makes a valid patch or what's going to get rendered. For instance, a simple spline like this, if I was to render that, you wouldn't see anything. It doesn't make a patch. Basically what it takes to make a patch is 4 points such as this. Let me extrude this line. Make a patch. If I was to render that now, you'd see that it actually renders. Also 3 points make a patch. If I got rid of one of these points, it also makes a valid patch. So basically 3 or 4 points makes a patch. The only exception to that rule is if your 3 or 4 points lie on the same spline. Let me clear this out, and I'll add one from scratch. Notice so far this whole spline is one continuous spline. And I loop it back around to itself, it is still one continuous spline. If I tried to render that, it would not render. This is useful for making holes in objects. You can intentionally make a 4-point patch not render by making it one continuous spline. All I have to do to make this render, let me peek this. Right now it doesn't render. If I was to remove one side of this by cutting it out, and out here off to the side, I'm going to weld one in right here and right here. And then I can delete these little guys. That will now make a rendering patch. While I'm showing you this, I'll show you one other handy feature. That's the grid. I'm going to go to Preferences for Sculpture. You'll see you have the ability to turn on a grid. I'm going to make it visible. You also have the option of having your mouse automatically snap every point you add and every point you move to grid intervals. I'm going to turn that on also. Now what happens is as I move these points around, they're going to jump by units of 20, or the size of the grid. Now they don't necessarily snap to a grid point, they snap by grid intervals. There's another feature called Snap Selected to Grid, which you'll find under the Edit menu, which actually snaps the selected control points right to a grid point. And then from then on, as you move it, they actually snap right to a grid point. So let's select all those and snap them all to the nearest grid point. And now we'll move this one in to square it up. That way you can get easy symmetrical objects such as a square, stuff like that. The grid is also handy for measuring, since you now know that in your preferences you set your grid to be 20 units for spacing. You know that each one of these is 20 units. And if you're trying to make something to scale, that comes in handy. Another thing we can do is something called break, which is the ability to basically snap a spline into 2 splines. Let me round this one back out by smoothing it. And this spline runs from the top of the vase all the way down to the bottom. I want to break out this middle section, so I'm going to click it. Notice it's highlighted in green, and click the break button. Now this becomes one short spline up here and one short spline down the bottom. It's broken. If I wanted to re-weld one back into there, I could attach one to here and re-weld it back into there. Let's group the top half of this, and I'll show you some of the ability to hide portions of your model so you can work on a particular portion of it. Now that I've got that grouped, when you click the hide button, anything that's not grouped disappears. It's still there, you just don't have it in your way for sake of modeling, getting in there and doing close-up stuff. Now let's say I still needed to hide more. I wanted to group the front of this and actually just show this. If I was to click the hide button right now, everything else would come back because you're turning off hide. If you right-click hide, it hides more. Basically all you get is again the selected control points. We've also got such powerful features as the ability to say, well, let's zoom in on this. Say I want to add a point in between these two. Of course, I can always get really close to it and add. Sometimes when you've got a whole lot of splines coming through one area, it's sometimes easier to maybe click on that control point, and you'll see that the actual spline you have selected highlights in green. You can advance through all the multiple splines that pass through that one control point by clicking the next button up here. Every time you click it, you cycle to the next spline that runs through that control point. So once you've got it on the one you want, you can just say insert. That will insert a point on that spline. Of course, you've also got delete, which will delete a point off of that spline. You've also got the ability to unattach. Right now we've got one spline running down through here, one spline running around the other way, but they're both coming through one control point. If I need to unattach those for some reason, I can right-click on break, and that will pop those 2 points apart. Now they become 2 individual splines with separate points. Anytime you need to attach, which is the opposite of that, you can drag the point you want to attach to over the other point, and while dragging with your left button, tap the right button. That will readjoin the two. Creating your own animations is certainly a rewarding experience. And as you can see from this video manual, it's not that difficult, as long as you have the right tools. You have a story to tell, and we're giving you the technical sophistication to help tell it. Good luck. I hope you have as many hours of enjoyment putting these tools to good use as I have.